Good evening and welcome to Hidden Histories, URBAN-15's online monthly cultural and arts web show. Tonight we have a very special evening because we're going to talk about those very special people in our community who need particular attention and a particular love, and that is the special needs young people of San Antonio. We're going to explore the history of how we got to a point where we can take care of our young people who have trouble walking, hearing, seeing, thinking, moving their body limbs, and how throughout history sometimes these people were discarded and left on the edges, yet they have proven in our own time to be some of the leaders in the industry, in high tech, in media, people who were considered dumb because they couldn't read. It was a matter of dyslexia. And we find throughout the entertainment industry and in the literature world how many of our great artists or our great leaders had trouble in their childhood because of their special needs. So we feel very grateful tonight that with the funding of the Texas Film Commission, the Humanities Texas, City of San Antonio's Film SA Group, and especially the Santikos Foundation through the San Antonio Area Foundation, we feel very lucky that we can make a presentation tonight. We have two special guests in my heart, and that is Dr. Marisol Cortez, and we have one of Texas's greatest advocates of special need, the lawyer and activist advocate Karen Dalglish Seal, who is known throughout the state for her work at the Texas legislature to ensure that all children get a fair break in education and in the needs that they have. So we're gonna proceed tonight with a special show about San Antonio's special young people. And Dr. Cortez, welcome to Hidden Histories, and
thank you,
welcome
George.
back.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for having me back. Yeah.
Last year, your show on the lost neighborhoods of San Antonio really brought a social conscience into our Hidden Histories program. It brought us a very strong contemporaneous look at what is history. Mm-hmm. And history could be just yesterday, and you brought that very much into our consciousness. So tell me about tonight.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for having me back. And as you mentioned, I am the, well, you didn't mention it, but how this show came about was I'm the daughter of two special education teachers. They both worked many places, which we have some oral history testimony from them that they'll be talking about some of the places they taught, but they ended up teaching, both of them, in SAISD schools. So this is very much a local history. But what I find so interesting about it is that when they would talk about their teaching careers, and they've been retired for many years now, but when they would tell kind of the story, their personal stories, it occurred to me that these were also bigger histories that they were telling, because they really lived through and in many ways embodied some of the really profound institutional shifts that took place in the 70s and the 80s, when for the first time ever really in the history of the US, there were federal laws guaranteeing the right to public education for all students regardless of ability. And so I thought, this show is kind of the perfect opportunity to really highlight some of those histories, which I think even when we talk about civil rights in the United States in the educational sphere, we don't think about special education. We think about either racial integration of schools, sometimes we think about bilingual ed, but the story of special education is really an important part of that civil rights history that really we don't know about. And so I thought this is a really great Hidden Histories.
And the people, the personalities that go into social work, it's a special calling. It's almost as if it was their mission in life to help. And those people sometimes have been motivated either by the fact that they've had a family experience, a member of their own family having these needs and experiencing the difficulties and wanting to find a solution, or they come from a family that has been blessed with no problems, but when they see a family with problems, they've suddenly jumped into this almost evangelical approach to working with special needs.
Well, I don't know if I'd say evangelical, but I would definitely say justice. I think this is about disability justice, right? And I'm really excited that we have with us tonight somebody who kind of embodies both the historical perspective on special education, but also really that justice perspective as an activist, as a legal advocate for folks with kids with special needs in the schools. And so that's really kind of like my framework for how I understand my parents' story, is really when I hear them speak about their careers, I hear them tell this bigger history of disability justice and disability rights. So yeah, I'm excited about tonight's show.
Well, I look forward
yeah.
to your guest tonight, and I think we do want to jump real quickly into our surprise part of every show, and that's the hidden footage section of the piece. And tonight, what we found was a 1983 VHS recording of Dance Art SA. Artistic director was Kista Tucker. They were a dance company, and their studio was down there on St. Mary's Caddy Corner, Our Lady of Sorrows. And this was a dance company that was community-based, but they had well-trained dancers, and they played a profound impact on the dance community of San Antonio. Members of their ensemble or former students of Kista still dominate the arts community here in San Antonio in leadership roles or on boards as patrons. So we found this tape, and it was actually a piece of footage that was owned by the San Antonio Arts Council. And when the Arts Council disbanded, they gave their raw footage to Centro Aztlan. And Centro Aztlan didn't know what to do with the footage. They put it in storage in a basement. And that basement flooded. And all of the tapes from the San Antonio Arts Council were underwater for several days. I was brought into the picture because they asked me to take them to the dump because they didn't know what to do with them. And they were very saturated. And I asked the director at that time, with salvage rights, can I take these tapes? And of the over 200 tapes, we cleaned 7 of them so far. And surprisingly, one of the 7 was this performance by Dance Art SA. And I have a personal connection to that piece, and you'll find out later in the program. So, Jonathan, please, fly gently.
Well, we're back, and I would like to start our exploration of special education in San Antonio and in South Texas by welcoming our guest expert commentator, Karen Dalglish Seal, and she has over 40 years of experience in the field of special education as a teacher, as an administrator, as a parent of a special needs child, and now as an attorney. So welcome, Karen, and if you'd just like to share a little bit with us more about what you did those 40 years of your experience.
I started out even with special education even before I got into college. I had children in the same school I was in who had special needs, and I found them fascinating. I got to know someone in middle school and high school who was blind, and she taught me Braille. But when I went on to college, I got into Trinity, and there was no program here for blind. So I met June Grant, and she got me into teaching children with who had some kind of hearing impairment. And I went through her program, graduated, taught with the Regional Day School for the Deaf, then went on to Austin, taught at the School for the Blind at the Deaf Blind Annex. And at that point, I had both sign language and Braille, so it was a good match for my skills. Did that for 3 years, worked on a program for teaching the children how to do their own breakfast, and we actually spoke at a national convention about that particular program. Then after that, I went back to the Regional Day School for the Deaf, back to SAISD, and then into, a few years later, I had a child with a disability, and so I moved to the district where he was at, because I was getting a lot of calls. And so I did that for about 10 years of the time, going and actually working with children and teaching them, training them to become productive adults. And some of those kids are still working today. In fact, one of them's retired.
Wow. Yeah.
Then I went to, I was an administrator towards the end of that time. And then I went into administration further with Southwest ISD. And my time as an administrator was what got me into law school. And since then, I went to St. Mary's and became an attorney and an advocate for children with disabilities.
Yeah, and that's an amazing, time span to be working on all of those issues from such a variety of different angles too. Can you maybe provide some legal, historical context for the development of special education in the U.S.? I think we have a timeline here that we can put up, but maybe just talk about, that's a lot of information, so maybe just talk about a few of those dates that were especially important to that history.
Sure. Special education actually got started in about 1856 with the Texas School for the Blind and the Texas School for the Deaf, because these children needed very specific learning and teachers that were very skilled. It only accepted, both of the schools only accepted white children. The children at the School for the Deaf, they're at the same campus they were at back in 1956, they're still there. The School for the Blind is a newer school. There was also a program that was for black children only, but it was a school for the deaf, blind, and orphan children. Wow. But it was totally separate. Back in about 1933, we got into parents really advocating for their children and saying, our children should be in school too. We've moved forward. There were a lot of laws that came into play, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, the Education for Handicapped Children Act. But in 1965, it was that Elementary and Secondary Education Act that provided funding and gave access to education, and these children were slowly brought into the school. But there were also a lot of separate but equal facilities. 1973, we had the Rehabilitation Act that required accommodations for children with special needs, but it really didn't. It was really a simple paragraph, simply saying you can't discriminate based upon disability, but it was a federal law.
Right.
And it was important at that point because they started using that to move children into our schools. Then we have the Education for the Handicapped Act that came along in 1975. Then finally, the Education of the Handicapped Act kind of morphed into, and that was, Education for the Handicapped Act was 94-142 is what everybody referred to it as. And that kind of morphed into the current law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which has been modified again in 2004, but has been the primary law under which our children can enter the schools and have access.
Yeah. So it really seems to me when I hear that history that 75 law, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, really kind of set up a before and an after when it came to access to education for children with disabilities. Like before that law, if you were a parent with a child with special needs, you really had to try to get those needs met outside of the school system, whether it was the church or a nonprofit, or you were independently wealthy, or educating your kids at home. But it was outside of that school system. And the interview that I did with my dad, I think is interesting because it really kind of, even just hearing him describe all of the various places he worked over the years, gives you a sense of that movement, of that historical movement. And just to give you kind of a little bit of context for the video, because there's pieces of it that I cut out. He graduated college in 1970, and he went into the National Teacher Corps, which really is kind of like the precursor or an early version of Teach for America, right? So they were looking for college graduates. In many cases, they were looking for minority teachers that would then serve the underserved schools with both in the inner cities and in rural communities. And he, through the National Teacher Corps, he was able to get his master's degree in special education. And in 1971 started teaching in the public schools in Chicago. He's from here, but he was up in the Midwest at the time. He taught there a couple years, and then he and my mom moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where he taught at the Portal Foster Center, which was like you were kind of mentioning, it was a parent organized and run school for kids and young adults, primarily with either psychiatric disability or developmental disability, or both. And in the video we're about to show, he refers to it as a church school. It's not really a church school, but the church provided the space,
Right.
because there was no place in the public school system for the school. And it was actually administered by a local nonprofit, which was the Madison Association of Retarded Citizens, as it was called at the time. And before we roll it, I'll just say that my dad, he was really kind of, for putting together a history, he was really amazing because he kept everything from every job that he had, and it was all neatly organized in files and labeled with dates and everything. And so as when we were editing the video, we were able to insert some of that archival material as he's speaking. So let's go ahead and watch his oral history.
And I applied at this one church school at the time. It was a school that was organized by parents who were trying to find services, educational services for their children. And their children ranged from ages 5, 6 years old all the way up to 21. Mm-hmm. And the difficult thing about that was that most of those students were very severely disabled. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't anything in the schools at the time and to really serve them. And even so, the parents organized themselves, and they were funded via associations, and I believe at the time the county also did some help there with that. Mm-hmm. And so I was there for about 4 years, And I worked with students who had resided at the state hospitals and schools, and some of very hard to work with, very ill, very mentally ill, psychotic, schizophrenics, mute, deaf, blind, just a whole gamut. So I worked there and I got hooked. After being there for all those years, I got hooked there to really stay within the field, to really stay within that group. We moved back here to Texas, and we wanted to go to some warmer climate. And so we chose Corpus Christi. We thought that it would be nice to be there with the beaches and, with the warm weather. So we applied there for school, and I, at the time, wanted to remain in the same area. I enjoyed the work I was doing with students, Madison. And so it was, at the time, the schools did not offer much because there wasn't really much out there. So I did work at the state hospital, and I was there. It was a very brief stint there, but I wasn't really doing anything teaching. I wasn't doing anything with the children. What I was doing out there, I was just trying to fill in form work, and so I was away, and I was just swamped with that, at the time. And that didn't last long. I didn't like the fact that I wasn't really involved with kids. I left there after a few months, and I applied to the district schools there, CCISD, and I was assigned to work at Wilson School, Ada Wilson School, that was orthopedically involved children, and they were being dealt with nearby, right next door, in fact, at the clinic. Some of these were MDs, muscular dystrophy children, and they range from ages, I guess 8, 9, 10 years old on up. MDs, LLDs, again, just a very varied group. Yet, though, they all were quote unquote normal. This was part of the district school there. So they were being served, but they were being served there as a unit because they received all of their necessary ancillary type of services, their speech and OT, PET, and all of that was being served there. So that was the best placement, right there. Okay. So I was there for 4 years, and I enjoyed the work there, but I enjoyed the kids a lot. The students were really great. After my work there, we moved back to town here to San Antonio. As I say, I was born and raised here, in the city, and my folks still lived here in town, so we wanted to come back again over here to be with them. I had been gone for years. So we moved back, and I applied to the district, to the SAISD here in town. And at the time, again, I had asked to see if maybe I could work at a school that served the type of children that I had worked with in the past. And so I was assigned to a school in town that was one of the first, if not the first, unit that served autistic children. Okay. At the time, there was only 3 or 4 in my room. They were ages 6 to maybe 10.
And where was that?
It was in Burnett Elementary School, okay, downtown. And I was assigned there for a year. And it worked out great. After that, I thought that I could do more, that I could offer more to the district. So I applied as an educational diagnostician. So I did that, and again, I found myself doing less and less work, interactive work with children, and adults. So I left that and then got back into the classroom, and from there I went to, I was assigned, and again I had asked to work with the same kind of students that I had worked in the past, so I was assigned to Jaffet Elementary at the time. I was assigned there, and even though it was a school that dealt mainly with orthopedically involved students in the past, in years past, it was beginning to change over, and there were some classes, portables there at the time that would deal with multi-handicapped children. And not only orthopedically involved that were quote unquote normal intelligence, but multi that were a little bit lower leveled children. So I was assigned to a room there, multi. There must have been 10 or 12 students in the classroom at the time, and I had assistants there. I had 2 of them there that worked with me, and trying to get them, I suppose, to go into their next phase there of training of school, which at the time there wasn't much out there still. So I remained there for 2 years, and what was occurring at that time was that the law came into being, and that students were asked, districts were being told the law had to come into effect that to LRE, the least restrictive environment, that they had to be placed out. They had to be integrated into regular school settings. So after a few years there, my room was one of the first rooms that got moved out to Burbank High School.
Okay.
So at the time I had a class that consisted of students that came from the state school, which the state schools were beginning to also funnel a lot of the kids out into schools. And so difficult job to really have them come in that they had never been out. Some of them had always been taught there at the state school level, in schools there. And so the law dictated that no, now we can't have them. Now they're supposed to be out, mainstreamed. Even though there was a gap there was a lag there. Trying to implement everything, busing, trying to implement therapies that some of the kids needed and things. It just took a while to organize all of that. And so that's the reason why, even though I thought it was quick, I thought it was fast. As soon as my room, and there was a few other rooms that got moved out, and it was difficult because lots of people weren't used to being thrown out there. There was others that came about too. So, just a matter of a few years before, they were all out there.
Well, I mentioned what's so interesting to me about his story is that you can really see that trajectory historically from, these separate, quote unquote, separate but equal campuses that were segregated to this move to deinstitutionalize those spaces, right? And to then integrate those children into public schools.
Sure, and you've got to realize that there were schools that were, like in SAISD, that were doing that in the early 60s to some extent. They were on Ben Franklin campus, because same campus I was on as a child. And they did have students who were in the middle school, high school, in pretty much the regular program. One I know with visual impairments because she was my friend. But, it took a while. And the reason why they needed Jaffet so badly at that point was because none of their schools were accessible. Until they started tearing down the old schools, and they still have a lot of the old schools. They've had to make them accessible. But like the first school I was at was Wheatley, which was Brack, then Wheatley, then Brack again, Brackenridge. They expected, you know, at that time, we then had an accessible building. But the old Brackenridge was in no way accessible.
Yeah.
So they had to have a place to put the children as the law was being, you know, demanding that they educate our
Right.
children with disabilities.
So, and then we'll get to Japhet more directly in just a minute, but I did want to ask you, so aside from sort of those places or those schools where they did have sort of limited accessibility before that 1975 law, where, you know, if you were blind or you were deaf or you were autistic or in a wheelchair, where could you be educated outside of the school system? So what were some of the agencies or
A lot
institutions?
of places like Sunshine Cottage we've talked about. A lot of them were private church-sponsored schools. A lot of parent groups got together and developed programs for children with disabilities because the schools weren't accepting them. Now, some might, like SAISD was pretty willing to do that, but some of the school districts, even within San Antonio, there's 16 districts here. Some of them were willing to take children with disabilities, others were not. And then you had to hire very specialized teachers. They're not that easy to come by. Right now even, special education teachers usually can find employment because they're needed so badly.
Yeah, and that was why my dad went in, when he was in the teacher corps, into that field, because they needed, that's the field that they needed folks in most. But let's come back to Japhet, because it's actually kind of interesting in the history of Texas, really. There is an article by the local historian Paula Allen that I came across that actually says that Japhet, as far as she could tell from her archival research, was the first, not necessarily the first program in a public school in Texas to serve special needs students, but it was the first special needs serving school in the public school system in Texas. And it opened in the 1940s. It was in February 1945. It opened as what was then called Japhet Opportunity School. And we have a picture here of the founder from the UTSA Special Collections, Eloise Japhet. So she was a polio survivor, and she headed up a committee called, I think it was the Community Committee for Crippled Children, and opened that school. What else do you know about Japhet and the history it played in San Antonio?
A big part of it was what you mentioned about having polio. We had a large epidemic of polio, with a lot of children ended up in wheelchairs with braces, and they didn't have the accessibility. So Japhet was the school that they opened up in order to educate these children. And it was still the separate but equal situation, but at least they could get an education. There was no way to, in some of our public schools, that you could get these children in and out to different places they needed to go, different classrooms.
Right.
And we still have injuries in some of our rural schools because things are not totally accessible.
Yeah, and so I think the interview that we have that really shows that kind of double-edged sword of those segregated campuses. We have an interview with somebody who attended Japhet in the 60s and 70s. She graduated in 1977, and she talks about, you know, yes, I wish I could have gone to a regular public school, but at the same time, with mobility impairment, it was a school that I could go to, right? So let's watch that interview with her, with Francisca Silguero, who from first grade to her graduation in 77 was in Japhet. So let's hear some of her story.
My name is Francis or Francisca Silguero, with my married name, Sanchez maiden name. Yes, I grew up here in San Antonio, born and raised here. I started on the first grade. Yeah, I had been attending public school Desabala Elementary. But it was really hard for me to walk to school and walk back home. So when my mom heard about this school, she went and registered me at that school. It was pretty much like the other schools, except that, of course, it was where there weren't any stairs, and we could walk around and everything. They did have a therapy department, and they had classes for deaf upstairs. And what else? They one thing that I really remember is that that's where I got my name changed from Francisca to Francis. Because when I was in the first grade, the teacher, they didn't want us to speak in Spanish. So that's how my name became Francis. And Francis with an E, not an I. And they changed my name. Yeah, but basically, the classes were just regular classes like everywhere else. In the mornings, I would be picked up by the school bus, and at first when I started going, I would need help going up the stairs of the bus, and that was really hard. So then the bus driver decided to let me up on the wheelchair lift, so they would put me on the lift and I would get up in the bus like that. And I remember the first day that I went to school and was waiting for the bus, and I got in and sat in the front seat. And the driver told me, "No, those seats are already taken. You have to go to the next seat." So I had to move. Okay. So, but most of the time I rode on the second seat of the bus, and when I needed help, like carrying my books and stuff, so the other girls would help me with that. Yeah, students, and they were really good.
At that time, did you use a chair?
No, at that time I used to walk. I walked. And that's why it got so difficult when I was going to the school, because it was so far. And I wore a long brace on this one and a short one on this one. And I don't know why, but this brace kept hitting the back of my leg, and then it was always bleeding because of that. I would get cut, so it was really difficult.
Yeah. I wanted you to have.
To my mom, it was very important, yes. And she was always wanting the best for us, and since it was hard for me to get to that school, she wanted me to go to this other school. Even though I'm not sure, but I heard that the doctor really didn't want me to go to a special school.
Oh, why was that?
I don't know. He just wanted me, I guess, to be with the regular kids, but my mom said, "No, well, she's gonna miss a lot of school, and I don't want that for her."
Serve if you were in a wheelchair, or like if you had mobility?
Well, except for the school did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other schools, they did not. They didn't have any.
No buses at all.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. So all kids just walk.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they did meet my needs pretty much. I think it would have been nice if I could have gone to a public school and integrated with the other kids. But I feel that they did do a good job. From there, I went to college after I graduated from high school. So I went to San Antonio College, and then went to Our Lady of the Lake for social work. And I work at the San Antonio State Hospital, with the mentally ill. I began with a mobile unit that they had. We would go outside of San Antonio to different counties, and we started programs over there. And then from After that unit was dissolved, then I went to the chemical dependency unit at the hospital, and then the unit, acute care, which is a unit where patients come in, the entrance. Well, it's come a long ways, that's for sure. That kids have a very big advantage nowadays that they can do just about anything and pursue whatever they want.
And that wasn't the case when you...
No, because buildings weren't accessible, and if it wasn't for this new law where you can go into a building, that they have to be able to provide that for you, that we couldn't do that.
So I know, we've been talking a lot about this before, right, before that federal law came into being. Let's talk a little bit about after. I know you started your teaching career right when that law came into effect in the mid-'70s. What do you remember about how that kind of rolled out for you as a teacher, for your students in that time period?
Mostly what I remember is that we were still very segregated, that you had your classroom and the children stayed mostly in the classroom with you. They weren't going out as much. Now there was some, but it was slow. They were slow to make that progress, to take those steps. People didn't feel as comfortable. They didn't know what to do with them. And there was a lot of bias there. You'd have people saying, well, you have 16 kids in your classroom. That's all you have to teach. And I'm going, let's see, I'm going to teach those kids 7 periods a day. And I have to teach them each one individually, because each one has an individual education plan. And I have to address that plan. And they have to pass everything on that plan. So it was a very different, but it slowly started to the point where they were moving, to regular classes and with an interpreter, but it took a long time.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of parallels in your teaching experience and then like my mother's. My dad taught the older kids, he taught high school levels, she taught in the elementary schools mostly, although she did do some middle school and some older kids a little bit at the beginning of her career. Her first teaching job in '75 was in Mathis, Texas, which is a rural town, rural community outside of Corpus, where my dad was teaching. Later on, when they moved back to San Antonio, her first job, I think, here in the city was at actually a residential facility, which was all ages, but they were like some school-age kids that lived there all the time, and the teachers would go into the institutions, into the facilities, and teach there. From there, she was at Hawthorne for a number of years, again in the portables, which was where they sent the classrooms at Japhet. When they broke up Japhet and sent the units out, they sent a number of them, I think she said 6, to Hawthorne. And then she did some teaching at Ruiz Middle School and ended her career the last 10 years, I want to say, 10, 15 years at Carvajal Elementary on the west side, working with the little kids, early childhood special ed. But what I find most striking about her interview is that kind of movement, how inclusion was rolled out, how it was received by the other teachers, by the administration, and then her memories of just that first classroom teaching in Mathis, Texas, and what that was like. So let's hear from that interview now.
When I started at the University of Madison, I started out as I was a Spanish major, and I did I had to do a practicum for one of my education classes, and I did it at the Portal Foster Center, where your dad taught. And that time, this was before they had passed that law, and this was a school associated with the Association for Retarded Citizens, ARC, and it was a school that the parents had started. because their kids weren't accepted in the public schools at that time. And I just found the population so interesting that I decided to switch majors, and I went into special education. And plus the fact that it was, they had such a good department in that area working with trainable kids, they called them. There was 2 classrooms. I had the 3 to, I'm trying to remember, 10, 11-year-olds, and the other teacher had the older kids. So I think an expression that the supervisor at the time used, that they were just going out to all the ranches and finding these kids and just pulling them into school. Sometimes it was a matter too that the parents were afraid, of what might happen to their kids, because they were so used to, just they were their caretakers, and this was a whole new idea for them too. Like as I had said before, we taught in the church hall of the Catholic school, so that every morning we sat up, or every Monday we sat up the classroom, and then every Friday we took it down so they could use it for services and stuff there. I had a $25 budget.
For the year?
For the year. My assistant said I taught everything off a set of colored blocks. But plus also the 2 assistants that worked with those 2 classrooms were from that town, and they went around to the businesses and got them to donate stuff. They shopped at garage sales and got materials for the classroom, and then plus were my interpreters for the parents and for the kids, because a lot of them didn't speak English. And although I spoke Spanish, I didn't feel competent at that level. And I'm not sure at what point I only taught there a year, and I think the following year they moved them into the facility itself, or a couple of years after that. I had a couple of students that were blind, deaf, severely physically involved. I don't recall I think I had one little boy that may have been on this autism spectrum, but him and his sister, that as far as I could tell, if she had been in school, she would have been fine. She had a speech impediment, but of course by that time she was like 7, 8 years old and had never been in school, so she was behind. I was kind of wondered what happened to her, if she was able to go on. And actually I would say that, the education of children with disabilities was an outgrowth of civil rights. At that time, ARC was a big part of, advocates for people with particularly mental retardation, as it was called at that time. And when the civil rights, when they started integrating the schools on the basis of race, then that was when they started pushing for the same rights for their children. So the biggest changes I've seen, I always feel like, it's the inclusion. I feel like, starting in 1975, when those children were put in the public schools, and then till the end of my career, and then ongoing now too, was that step by step, more and more inclusion, where, at one time I felt like you kind of had to prove that they were ready for inclusion, but toward the end of the career, no, you had to prove why they couldn't go into the regular class for, however many hours or all day, or, however the amount that they would benefit from. Yeah, I always felt that in addition to, being a teacher, that I was also an advocate for those children. And while a lot of the teachers in the regular classes, accepted it and worked with me, there were those that I felt like, tell them what it was really like, what those children were really like, and that and not just with them, but I've always like tried to emphasize what those children can do, not what they can't do. And no, I didn't feel sorry for them. No, I didn't cry every time I went in the classroom because I felt so sorry for them. You know, it was my job to be, not to be patient with them sometimes, but to be impatient and push them to do all that they could do. And that was what I tried to bring across to the teachers that were resisting, that yes, I will be there to help you if you need me, you know, anything I can do to help that child succeed in your classroom. And no, I'm not going to put kids in there that aren't ready. At that time, you know, the inclusion was just starting, so yeah, it was a new idea for a lot of the teachers, even though they had seen them sometimes not on their such good behavior out in the cafeteria and on the campus. So yeah, you know, there was also that a little bit of fear that it would, maybe not a little bit, a whole lot of fear, that it would be totally disruptive to their class and they wouldn't be able to work with their other kids. You know, it worked. And then there were, like I said, there were teachers that I just loved working with because they were so supportive, and oh yeah, you know, and oh, don't you think they can be in my classroom longer? This was particularly in the early childhood part of it, that yeah, that really the inclusion was so nice. You know, teaching special ed was a good career, and I'm glad I did it. And I enjoyed each and every one, and that's my feeling. And it was, the point is, each and every one, they were all, every child I taught could learn something and did, and every child was an individual, just like, I mean, any child is an individual, whether they're in regular education or special education.
All right, well, we have just a few minutes left, so welcome back, George.
Thank you.
And we'd like to just close by getting your impression about some of that oral history. You know, what's your big takeaway from these memories of how things have changed over the years?
I think we have come a long way. I've seen a lot of improvement, a lot more inclusion, people becoming more accepting. And I think, if nothing else, it was very, very important. I think a lot of things that your mother mentioned, IDEA, what she was saying, the new law, brought in child find. We had a child find obligation where you were providing transition to students, so they were able to go from school to adult life and to be trained appropriately and taught appropriately, where they could be in with other students and where they would become accepted as part of the group.
Yeah.
As a community, it seems natural that people would want to help. But we have to make laws and we have to make mandates for school districts to behave in this fashion of taking care. We're a big county with lots of school districts. Tell me, I'd like to know, what's your view of the behaviors of the various school districts?
My view of the behaviors of the school districts is that sometimes they do things beautifully and sometimes they don't. And that's why we're here, to help encourage them. But a big part of what we do is education. Education means educating the parents. It means educating the schools. It means working with them, helping them to see what they need to be seen, that they can kind of get the overall big picture. We talked earlier about charter schools, and that charter schools specifically have the ability to expel children to their home district, that they have the ability to fail children with special needs, which seldom happens. If you've got an individualized education plan, that means that plan should be meeting that child's needs. There's no reason to ever have to fail a student with special needs. And there's other issues that I have, especially with the charter schools, The districts have their own, but they're all individualized differences. And they're doing some amazing things, and they make mistakes like everybody else. And you got to kind of let them off the hook for little mistakes.
So what do you think needs to change most, kind of moving forward? You know, what do you see as the most critical contemporary issues? You mentioned charter schools. Are there others that sort of come up again and again as an activist or an advocate?
One of the issues that comes up a lot is that even when they find that the children are doing what is related to their handicap, their disability, that a lot of times they're sending them to juvenile. And juvenile court does everything they can to work with them or to dismiss their cases, but that's not where they belong, and they don't need that negative impact on their lives. And we've had some really, high success stories with our children, and I see as contemporary issues that we need to get children more included. We need to get them more heading into vocational when they need it. I think we need to do that with all our kids, though. I think we need to be setting up other channels for transition. We're not all college bound.
You know, we baby boomers, we're getting a little bit older, and we're looking back upon our lives and want to still make a difference. What is it that people can do, our audience can do, to help in these kind of situations? Where do you think we as outsiders, not within the system, can help best to make things better?
I think we can help best by advocating, by trying to help educate parents in the best way you can, that maybe you should be looking someplace else. If this is not working, maybe there's advocates out there, which there are. There's advocacy groups, there's individual advocates who can help. And by telling people that there's more to, that there's more they can do for their child, that the education system is set up to help those children.
What about, I've been hearing kind of in the news, I guess starting a couple of years ago, about a situation where the state of Texas was capping the percentage of students in the public school systems that could receive special education services. Can you tell us a little bit about that situation?
Yes, the state of Texas was capping the number of students you could have, not numbers, but percentage-wise. Mm-hmm. There was an 8.5% cap, whereas nationally, there's the average the percentages are really about 10 to 14%. So it was a large number of children who were not being identified. Mm-hmm. So we were not meeting, as a state, our child find obligations. And the federal government did come down on the state of Texas, did take away some of its funding, and did, tell them this is not right. Of course, Texas then sued the federal government, and Texas lost because it was federal law mm-hmm. that they were violating. And when they lost, they ended up paying fines, attorney fees, and we lost a lot of money that we need for our children with special needs. Mm-hmm.
Now, there are a lot of young people that are going into college and they're taking music therapy and they're going in art therapy and, just occupational therapy courses, and they're getting degrees in this. Are they finding meaningful employment in the school systems with the high-tech and highly trained skill sets that they've acquired?
Yes and no. Yes, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists are desperately needed in the schools, and they're used. Schools are still, like most people, they don't like change. So things like play therapy, they think about, but they'll do it. Things like play therapy, like art therapy, they really do have more trouble with that. Nowadays, it's ABA, trying to work with behaviors. So we're trying to convince the schools that they want to do that. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult because it's expensive. and you have to be specifically trained. But more schools are getting in behavior therapists, and those behavior therapists are able to work with the children, provide services. So yes, those people are getting jobs, and we're seeing more and more of a variety of therapies that go into training our children and helping to educate them.
Mm-hmm. Well, any final words that you wanted to offer about the future of disability justice, disability rights struggles here in San Antonio and beyond?
Yes, I think that our main goal needs to be to make our children with special needs as productive as possible. When they're sitting at home collecting SSI checks, we're not helping them. I mean, some kids will need that after high school. But if we can make them productive, if we can get them jobs, if we can include them not just in school, mm-hmm. but in our neighborhoods, in our cities, then we're having productive people who are happier with their lives, who are doing things that are meaningful. And I think that's what we need to be, what our goal needs to be. How do we get them there? And I think sometimes the schools are thinking about how do we educate them? How do we educate this child? And they're not thinking, how do we make that child a productive person sometime here in the future? Mm-hmm. And that's an essential part of what we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do in the community, for your long history of activism and advocacy and teaching. And George as well, because you've done the music therapy, you've done it from the art side, right? So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us.
I was glad to be here, and I'll tell you, we've had a lot of success working with the schools, getting kids onto college, getting kids into work. I've had one child that like I said, that has actually retired. So those are good things. Mm-hmm.
Well, these are the histories that Hidden Histories wants to uncover and bring to light. And I want to thank both of you for your great work tonight. You're bringing up subjects and thoughts that many of us just don't spend time thinking. And it's now in our brain. We can't hide it anymore. Okay, well, listen, thank you very much, everybody, for getting online tonight and watching Hidden Histories. This is a very special San Antonio show, and I really appreciate it. Next month, in June, we're going to have Father David Garcia from Mission Concepcion down the street, and he's going to come in and talk to us a bit about how Vatican II impacted San Antonio in terms of the vernacular, the liturgy, the social action that the Catholic Church became involved in those first 4 years immediately after Vatican II ended. And we know throughout the rest of the year, every first Monday of the month, Hidden Histories. Thank you very much. A special thanks to, again, our technical crew, Jonathan Anderson and Homer Villarreal and Comal Velat over here who are working the floor and making this possible. We'd like to also thank our artistic director who made this conceivable, Catherine Cisneros. And special thanks to the Urban 15 board and all of our good friends out there, friends of Urban 15, who continually send us letters of support, some money, but lots of good wishes. Thank you. Good night.